The Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, meeting with NATO defense ministers in Belgium today. On the agenda, plans to beef up troop presence in the Baltic states and Eastern Europe in the face of Russian aggression. The coalition will also discuss how to handle border security among EU nations as the influx of refugees from the Middle East intensifies.
Well, those refugees fleeing violence at the hands of ISIS, and we're getting word today that the terror group has now claimed responsibility for an attack in Damascus, the Syrian capital. This as Secretary of State John Kerry makes a push for more negotiations tomorrow over Syria. In the meantime, the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. You know the numbers. You have more than 200,000 dead. That's the estimate at least now. 4 million have fled the country and are now refugees, and a new wave happening this week as well, as Russian airstrikes are reportedly targeting civilians and are succeeding in helping Assad remain in power as government forces push into the major city of Aleppo. A new op-ed in the Washington Post reads this: as Russian planes decimate Aleppo and hundreds of thousands of civilians in Syria's largest city prepare for encirclement, blockade, and siege, and for the starvation and the barbarity that will inevitably follow, it is time to proclaim the moral bankruptcy of American and Western policy in Syria. Charles Glass is a veteran Middle East journalist, author of the book Syria Burning, ISIS and the Death of the Arab Spring, and we're glad to have you back on the program, Charles, because you were recently in Syria in September. There's a noticeable change in the news that we're getting from Syria that is signaling that despite all the bloodshed we've heard about in the last 5 years, that now we're at a new level and that Assad really looks to be making some moves along with Russia. What stands out most to you about what you're hearing about the situation on the ground and why it matters?
Well, between September and now, the situation has reversed completely. Then the regime was on the defensive, and because it was on the defensive and it was losing, the Russians stepped in with massive firepower to support Syrian ground forces and Iranian and Hezbollah ground forces from the air, which have enabled them to take vast swathes of countryside and to move in and surround the parts of Aleppo which have been in rebel hands for a number of years. This is clearly a time of victory for the regime, which it must be very pleased about. However, if the Turks, the Saudis, the Qataris, the U.S., British, French, others who have been backing the opposition step up their game, then the situation will be reversed yet again and the war will go on.
How do we end this?
There seems to be only one way to end this war, because no one can actually win outright, and that's a diplomatic solution. Tomorrow there's a meeting in Munich among the outside powers who are involved. They have to agree on a solution which would involve a transitional period in Syria, and then when they go back to Geneva with the Syrian participants, to impose that solution and stop arming both sides and stop giving all kinds of support, financial and otherwise, to both sides to bring this war to an end. If the war doesn't end, then the country remains an area of anarchy and chaos in which groups like IS and Jabhat al-Nusra will flourish.
In the meantime, though, we know what's happening on the ground in Syria. Although our information is limited still, we do know that Assad does surround these cities, starves the people inside them. We see the images, and that's apparently what's going to be happening for Aleppo. And in the Washington Post editorial that we read a little bit from, the author says that we are morally complicit in this as the United States of America, because we haven't done more on the humanitarian side, and we know what's happening. What is the appropriate role for us now?
Well, there are two things. There's the political level at which the United States has failed from the very beginning. It made a judgment early in 2011 that the regime could be easily overthrown, and we have now seen through the hindsight of the past 5 years that the regime was indeed very strong, both militarily, and it had some degree of support from the population. That was a political failure. The moral failure is now there have been donor meetings sponsored by the United Nations in the last few days at which not nearly enough money has been raised to feed the people in the camps in Syria and on the borders of Syria, and that's why those people are leaving, because they can't feed their children. And these are two failures, and I think the Post is right to say that there is a case of moral bankruptcy by the Western powers involved, but it isn't just now. It's been from the beginning.
Well, it's certainly, as we look back on the last 5 years and even reflect back on the last presidential election, President Obama was saying, well, Assad is going to be going soon. We know he's going to be going soon, and obviously we know that's not the case. Secretary Kerry, in addition to the diplomatic solution that they continue to try to pursue, is also talking about a plan B, a new military action. We've supported the rebels in limited fashion on the ground. What would a plan B look like if there is another military side or component to our solution or trying to help for a solution in Syria?
If John Kerry imagines that there is a military solution, I would say respectfully that he's mistaken. There is only a diplomatic solution to the war in Syria. The U.S. and Russia are backing different sides, and they can go on escalating it until all of Syria is destroyed, or they can stop it now, which is what they should do.
If they can, and that's a big if they can come together. We've seen them try to come together for these diplomatic talks, and it hasn't worked so far. So we'll continue to watch what's happening in Syria. Charles, you have an invaluable perspective, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.